The silence in the apartment was the loudest sound Elena had ever known. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that had settled in the day her husband, a man whose laughter used to fill every corner, was buried. Now, all that remained was the smell of dust and the stark white of an eviction notice taped to the door. Elena ran a trembling finger over the cold, official paper. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She was a seamstress. Her hands made for the delicate dance of needle and thread, but now they felt clumsy and useless. Her sewing machine, her livelihood, had been sold weeks ago, the money evaporating like mist. Now, the final notice felt like a tombstone marking the death of her old life. She could hear the faint, steady breathing of her 10-year-old son, Leo, asleep on a pile of blankets in the corner, the last pieces of furniture they owned. A wave of nausea rose in her throat. How could she tell him they had nowhere to go? The meager compensation from the construction company had been an insult disguised as charity. A few thousand reais for a man's life, her husband's life. The official report called it a tragic accident, but a cold knot of dread had been tightening in Elena's stomach ever since. He was too careful, too meticulous. Accidents didn't just happen to him, but the grief was a physical weight, so crushing it left no room for questions, only for the raw, aching reality of survival. The money was gone, eaten up by rent, by food, by the simple, relentless cost of staying afloat in a world that was trying to drown her. Hunger was a constant, dull ache in her belly, a pain she tried to hide from Leo, often giving him her portion while claiming she wasn't hungry. She felt the cold seep into her bones, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the encroaching despair. 50 reais, that was all. She unfolded the worn, wrinkled bills on the floor, the paper soft and fragile from being counted, and recounted 100 times, 4 10-real notes and 2 5s. She gathered the few loose coins, their metallic clink a pathetic sound in the cavernous emptiness of the room. Leo stirred, his eyes blinking open. He didn't cry or complain. He just looked at her with an unnerving maturity that broke her heart. "Is it time to go, Mama?" he asked, his voice small. Elena felt the sting of tears but forced them back. She couldn't fall apart. Not now, not in front of him. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and helped him put on his jacket. She took one last look at the bare walls, a ghost of a life that was no longer hers, before pulling the door shut behind them. The click of the lock echoed down the empty hallway. It was final. They were homeless. Their only option was a ghost story, a piece of family lore her husband had sometimes mentioned with a shrug, a derelict house, deep in the countryside, inherited from a great-uncle he'd never even met. It was a name on a piece of paper, a property described as having no electricity, no running water, a forgotten ruin on a forgotten patch of land. To her husband, it had been a worthless curiosity. To Elena, it was now the only thing standing between her son and the cold, unforgiving streets of the city. The thought of it filled her with a terrifying mix of dread and a sliver of hope, so thin it was almost transparent. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter. A roof, no matter how broken, was better than no roof at all. She clutched Leo's small hand in hers, the 50 reais tucked deep in her pocket, a pathetic shield against the vast, uncertain future. The journey was a blur of rumbling buses and the smell of diesel fumes, each kilometer taking them further from everything they had ever known. Elena stared out the window at the passing landscape, her own reflection, a pale, haunted face superimposed over the green blur. Leo had fallen asleep, his head resting on her shoulder, his small body warm against hers. She felt a surge of fierce, protective love that was painful in its intensity. She was his only shield, his only provider, and she was failing him. The cold basement she imagined, the rotten wood, the damp earth, it was a nightmare, but it was their only nightmare left. This descent into darkness felt absolute, a fall with no bottom in sight. Could a mother's love truly be enough to build a life from absolute ruin? To find out if Elena and Leo can survive this first night and what secrets their new, broken home is hiding, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The bus ride ended with a hydraulic hiss of brakes that seemed to sigh with exhaustion. They were deposited at a crossroads marked by a single, rust-eaten sign pointing down a dirt road. The air that hit them was thick and heavy, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves, a world away from the city's exhaust fumes. Silence pressed in on them, broken only by the chirping of unseen insects and the whisper of wind through tall, unfamiliar trees. Elena felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. The isolation was immediate and absolute. She looked at Leo, whose small face was pale, his eyes wide as he took in the wall of green that surrounded them. She forced a smile that felt brittle, like a mask about to crack. "It's an adventure, mio figlio," she whispered, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. She hoisted their single, overstuffed bag onto her shoulder, the strap digging into her skin, and took his hand. The dirt road stretched before them, a muddy ribbon disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Their journey on foot was a punishing march against hope. The 50 Ries had been decimated by the bus tickets, leaving them with just a few coins. Every step sent a jarring ache up Elena's spine. The bag, containing all their worldly possessions, felt heavier with each passing meter, a physical manifestation of her burdens. Leo, trying to be brave, walked silently beside her, but soon his steps began to drag. He stumbled, his small sneaker catching on a tree root. Elena's heart clenched. She stopped and knelt, wiping the mud from his knee with her thumb. His face was smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat. "Are we almost there, Mama?" he asked, his voice trembling with exhaustion. She could feel the fight draining from him, and with it her own. Looking at the crude map her husband had left, a faded drawing on a crumpled napkin, she could only guess. "Almost," she said, her voice hoarse. It had to be. They couldn't go much further. Then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. The house. The word felt wrong. It wasn't a house. It was a skeleton. The last vestiges of hope, a fragile ember she had been nurturing in her heart, were instantly extinguished, blown out by a cold gust of wind that swept through the clearing. It stood on a small rise, a jagged silhouette against the bruised purple evening sky. Part of the roof had completely collapsed, leaving a gaping wound open to the elements. The walls, made of dark, weathered stone and rotting wood, seemed to sag inward, as if the structure had given up, weary of standing. It was not a forgotten home. It was a grave. A wave of dizziness washed over Elena. Her legs felt weak. This wasn't a shelter, it was a ruin, a monument to decay, and she had dragged her son to the middle of nowhere to live in it. The desperation was a physical thing, a cold hand gripping her throat. As they drew closer, the scent of rot intensified, a putrid mix of mildew, wet wood, and something vaguely animal. It was the smell of complete abandonment. The windows were empty sockets, the glass long gone, shattered shards glinting like broken teeth in the dying light. The front door hung from a single hinge, groaning with every gust of wind. It was a mournful, welcoming sound that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. She stepped over the threshold, her foot landing on a floor soft with damp mulch and fallen leaves. The inside was even worse. Beams from the collapsed roof lay like giant, broken bones across the main room. Rain had warped the floorboards into a treacherous, uneven surface. Moonlight streamed through the hole in the roof, illuminating floating dust motes and the scuttling of unseen creatures in the shadows. It was a death trap, unlivable. Her stomach turned. She had failed, utterly and completely. But then she remembered the detail from the inheritance papers, a stone-walled basement. It was her last, desperate thought, the only part of the structure that might have survived the decay. She saw a set of narrow, stone steps leading down into blackness near the back wall. It was a terrifying prospect, descending into the earth, but the alternative was to stay in this open, crumbling wreck, or worse, turn back with nowhere to go. "Leo, stay close to me," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt. She pulled a small flashlight from their bag, its beam weak and flickering. The air coming from the stairwell was cold and dense, carrying the thick, musty smell of a place that hadn't seen the sun in decades. It smelled like a tomb, but it was their only chance. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Eleanor pointed the wavering beam of light into the abyss and took the first step down, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm of fear and failure. The basement was a cold, dark, concrete box. The air was so damp it felt like they were breathing water. thick with the suffocating smell of mildew. The floor wasn't stone or concrete, but packed to ice-cold dirt. In the corners, dark patches hinted at standing water, and the single high window was a grimy rectangle caked with years of dirt, letting in almost no light. The cold was a living entity. It didn't just surround them, it invaded them, seeping through their thin jackets and sinking deep into their bones. Elena felt a tremor run through her body, a violent, uncontrollable shiver of both cold and despair. She set their bag down on the dirt floor, the sound muffled and bleak. Leo huddled against her, his small body trembling. This was it. This was the bottom, a cold, damp hole in the ground. She wrapped her arms around her son, burying her face in his hair to hide the silent tears that finally began to fall. She wasn't just poor or homeless. She felt buried alive. The first night in the basement was a descent into a cold hell. Sleep offered no escape, only a shallow, shivering state of semi-consciousness. Elena held Leo tightly, trying to shield him with the inadequate warmth of her own body, but the damp cold was a relentless predator. It leached through their single shared blanket, through their clothes, and sank its teeth deep into their bones. Her own shivering was violent, a tremor that started in her core and shook her entire frame. The air was a thick, frigid soup that tasted of mildew and wet earth. Every breath was an icy shock to her lungs. She could hear the faint, chattering sound of Leo's teeth and felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. It was a suffocating, physical sensation, as if the cold dirt floor was slowly rising to bury them. This wasn't a shelter, it was a premature grave, and she felt the crushing weight of her failure with every shudder that racked her body. She had led her son to the bottom of the world, and she feared they would never climb out. She must have drifted off, not into sleep, but into a stupor of cold and exhaustion. When her eyes fluttered open, the dim grey light filtering through the grimy window was weak, signaling a dawn that promised no warmth. The first thing she noticed was a profound change in her own body. The violent shivering had stopped. A gentle, pervasive warmth cocooned her and Leo. It was a feeling so foreign, so utterly impossible in this frozen tomb, that for a moment she thought she was dreaming. Or perhaps that the final, deceptive warmth of hypothermia had set in, but it was real. Leo was sleeping soundly, his breathing deep and even, his face relaxed for the first time in days. A profound sense of confusion cut through the fog of her misery. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, sluggish rhythm of despair, began to thrum with a new, uncertain energy. She slowly, carefully, began to sit up, her muscles stiff and aching, her mind racing to comprehend this impossible change in their circumstances, and then she saw them, neatly folded at the foot of their makeshift bed of leaves, and one thin blanket were two new blankets. They were thick, heavy, made of dark grey wool, the kind that held warmth like a promise. They were immaculately clean, smelling faintly of cedar and dry air, a scent so alien in this chamber of decay it was almost shocking. One had been carefully unfolded and laid over her and Leo as they slept. Elena stared at them, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind reeled, trying to process the information. It made no sense. There were no footprints in the damp earth around them, no sign of entry. The single door to the basement, a heavy wooden slab, was still barred from the inside, just as she had left it. A cold knot of fear, entirely different from the fear of poverty, began to form in her stomach. This wasn't charity. It was a message, a silent, anonymous act that was both a profound kindness and a deeply unsettling intrusion into their desperate solitude. Her first instinct was to search. Adrenaline surged through her, overriding the morning chill. She carefully tucked the new, warm wool around Leo, who stirred but didn't wake, and then began a frantic, silent examination of their tiny prison. She ran her hands along the cold, damp concrete of the walls, pushing, tapping, searching for any hidden door or passage. Nothing. She unbarred the heavy basement door and peered up the stone steps into the ruined house above. The morning light illuminated the same scene of decay, the same chaos of fallen beams and debris. She climbed the steps, her bare feet flinching on the cold stone, and walked the perimeter of the wreck. The main door still hung open on its one rusted hinge. The empty window sockets stared back at her like vacant eyes. She circled the entire foundation of the house, her eyes scanning the soft, muddy ground around it. There were only her and Leo's footprints from the day before. No other marks. No sign that any human being had been anywhere near the property. She returned to the basement, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence of the place, once a sign of isolation, now felt watchful, charged with unspoken secrets. Who had left the blankets, and how? The questions circled in her mind, a dizzying carousel of fear and wonder. Was it a ghost, the spirit of the great uncle her husband never knew? The thought sent an icy shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Or was it a person, someone watching them from the shadows of the surrounding woods, someone who could enter and leave this place like a phantom? That idea was, in some ways, even more terrifying. They were completely vulnerable, exposed in a way she hadn't even considered. This anonymous benefactor, this guardian angel or silent observer, had shown they could reach them at any time, even in their sleep. The warmth of the blankets was now a source of deep paranoia. Every creak of the ruined house above, every rustle of leaves outside was a potential threat. Days crawled by in a strange new reality, a blend of monotonous survival and simmering anxiety. The woolen blankets were a constant, tangible reminder of the mystery. Eleanor and Leo were no longer cold, but a new kind of chill had settled in Eleanor's soul, the chill of being watched. She spent her days trying to make the basement more of a home and less of a cell, a desperate act of defiance against their circumstances. She cleared a corner of the dirt floor, sweeping it as best she could with a bundle of twigs. She found a few unbroken planks of wood upstairs and managed to drag them down, creating a slightly raised platform for their bed, a small victory against the damp earth. Leo, with the incredible resilience of a child, adapted. He found a small, partially deflated rubber ball in their bag, a relic from his past life, and it became his primary source of entertainment. He was a ghost of his former self, a boy who had learned to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, but the simple and repetitive act of bouncing the ball seemed to comfort him. The sound became the rhythm of their new life, a soft, repetitive thump, thump, thump against the concrete walls of the basement. It was a hollow, lonely sound, but it was better than the suffocating silence. Elena would work, sorting their meager possessions or trying to patch the grimy window with a piece of salvaged plastic. And the steady bouncing of the ball was a constant reminder that she was not alone, that her son was still with her, still finding a way to be a child in the face of impossible hardship. She found herself listening to the rhythm, her ears tuning to its nuances. The sound was slightly different on each wall. The north wall, which was mostly below ground, had a deep, solid thud. The east wall, where the steps led up, was slightly more resonant, but it was the west wall, a long, unbroken expanse of grey concrete, that held his attention. He liked the sound it made, a sharp, clear echo. Thump, thump, thump. It was a small, fragile pulse of life in a place of death and decay. It was on the fourth day that the rhythm broke. Leo was bouncing the ball with more energy than usual, trying to see how high he could make it go. Thump, thump. And then, from a section of the wall near the floor, came a different sound entirely. It wasn't a sharp thump, but a low, hollow thud. The ball barely bounced back, hitting the wall with a deadened impact. The abrupt change in the acoustic pattern was so stark that it made Elena freeze, her hand hovering over a small pile of kindling she was gathering. "Whoa," Leo said, his own game interrupted. He picked up the ball and, with the focused curiosity of a child, tapped the same spot again with his fist. Thud. It was a dull, wooden sound, completely out of place in a room made of concrete and dirt. Elena felt a jolt, a surge of adrenaline that was instantly familiar. It was the same feeling she'd had when she saw the blankets. A door was opening, not a physical one, but a door in the story of this place. She hurried over to where Leo was crouched, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Do that again," she whispered, her voice tight. Leo knocked on the spot once more. Thud. There was no mistake. It was hollow. Elena dropped to her knees, the cold and damp of the dirt floor seeping through her trousers, but she barely noticed. She ran her hands over the surface of the wall. It was cold, rough concrete, just like the rest of it. There was no visible seam, no sign of a panel or door. It looked, felt, and smelled exactly like the solid wall around it, but the sound was undeniable. A pocket of emptiness lay just beyond the surface. She pressed her ear against the cold concrete, her own breathing loud in the enclosed space, and had Leo knock again a few feet away. Thump! And then he knocked on the spot. Thud! The sound vibrated through the bone of her skull, a low, resonant boom that confirmed a cavity lay hidden on the other side. A secret, right there in front of them the whole time. Her eyes scanned the surface with frantic intensity. There had to be a seam, a crack, something. And then she saw it. It was almost invisible. A hairline fracture running vertically from the floor upwards for about a meter, disguised by the rough texture and discoloration of the old concrete. It wasn't a natural crack from settling. It was too straight, too perfect. Her fingers trembled as she traced it. This was it. A false wall. A hidden compartment. The blankets. The unseen benefactor. Was this what they were trying to lead her to? The thought was electrifying. She looked around the basement, her eyes landing on a length of rusted rebar she had noticed earlier, half buried in the debris near the staircase. It was heavy and solid. A tool. A key. Her mind, which had been dulled by hunger and despair, was now razor-sharp, focused on a single-edged obsessive goal, to see what was on the other side of that wall. Getting the rebar was an effort. It was wedged under a heavy, waterlogged beam, and she had to use all her strength to wrench it free, the muscles in her back and shoulders screaming in protest. It was nearly a meter long, a heavy, jagged piece of steel. It felt dangerous and powerful in her hands. She returned to the wall, Leo watching her with wide, silent eyes. He understood that something important was happening. Eleanor wedged the sharp, broken end of the rebar into the hairline crack near the floor. She put her shoulder into it and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. The metal scraped against the concrete with a sound that set her teeth on edge. She repositioned it, took a deep breath, and threw her entire body weight against it. A groan of resistance, and then a small crunch. A piece of concrete a few inches wide broke away, falling to the dirt floor and revealing not more stone, but a sliver of darkness. A wave of triumph and terror washed over her. It was real. She worked the rebar into the newly enlarged opening and pried. The sound was terrible, a grinding, screeching protest of concrete and hidden mortar giving way. Sweat beaded on her forehead and trickled into her eyes, stinging them. Her hands, soft from a life of sewing, were raw and scraped, but she didn't feel the pain. The section of wall began to move, scraping inward like a poorly fitted plug. With one final, desperate heave, the false panel, a thick slab of concrete backed with rotting wood, gave way and fell inward with a heavy, dusty thud into the space behind. A gust of air rushed out to meet them, and Elena recoiled from the smell. It wasn't the smell of mildew and damp. It was the scent of immense age, of dry paper, of stagnant, undisturbed air, and a faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang. It was the smell of a time capsule. She shone her weak flashlight into the opening. Her breath hitched. It was a small dry cavity, a carefully constructed space about a meter square, completely protected from the damp that permeated the rest of the basement. And sitting directly in the center of the clean, stone-paved floor of the cavity was a single object, a metal strongbox. It was black, its surface pitted with age and spotted with rust, especially around the hinges and the heavy-duty lock on the front. It wasn't large, about the size of a shoebox, but it radiated a sense of importance, of secrets kept under lock and key for decades. Leo let out a small gasp. Elena felt a dizzying vertigo, a sense that she had just stumbled into a story that had been waiting in the dark for a very, very long time. This was no accident. The blankets, the hollow wall, this box. It was a deliberate trail of breadcrumbs. But who had left it? And what were they leading her to? The box was heavy, heavier than it should be. She dragged it out of the hole and into the main space of the basement, the metal scraping against the dirt. The lock was thick and formidable. There was no key. For a moment, a wave of frustration hit her. To come this far, to be stopped by a piece of metal. But her determination was afire now. She looked at the rebar, still clutched in her hand. It was a tool for breaking. She wedged the tip into the seam of the box's lid, right next to the lock. She positioned her foot on the box to hold it steady and pulled back on the bar with all her might. The metal groaned. It bent. The lock was stronger than the rebar. Panic flickered in her chest. She couldn't fail now. She took a breath, repositioned the rebar, and instead of pulling, she began to hammer the end of it with a large rock she found nearby. The noise was deafening in the small space, a series of sharp metallic cracks that echoed off the concrete walls. Crack, crack, crack. Leo covered his ears, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. Each blow sent a jarring vibration up Elena's arms. The metal of the box dented, it screeched, it protested, but the lock held. She was pouring every ounce of her frustration, her grief, and her desperate hope into each strike. It was a battle against her circumstances, against the forces that had left her in this cold, dark hole. The rebar was her weapon. The box was the gate, and she would not be denied. Crack. A louder, more final sound. The rusted metal of the hasp finally gave way, twisting and snapping. The lock fell to the dirt floor with a dull clink. Silence descended, heavy and expectant. The box was open. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely lift the lid. It was heavy, and it opened with a low, mournful creak, like a coffin. She aimed the trembling beam of her flashlight inside. For a heartbeat, she couldn't process what she was seeing. The light reflected off something with a soft, buttery glow. Gold. A small, hand-stitched cloth bag sat on top of a pile of papers, and it had spilled some of its contents. Gold coins, old and heavy, gleamed in the faint light. They were impossibly beautiful, a pirate's treasure in a concrete tomb. Elena reached in with a trembling finger and touched one. It was cool, smooth, and heavy. Real. A choked sob escaped her lips, a sound of disbelief and overwhelming shock. This was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. It was a fortune. It was a way out. It was a miracle. But underneath the bag of coins, there was more. She carefully lifted the bag out, its weight astonishing, and set it aside. Beneath it were stacks of old paper money, bound with crumbling rubber bands. They were cruzeiros, the currency of Brazil from a bygone era, worthless as cash now, but they spoke of the age of this hidden treasure. And beneath the stacks of obsolete money lay the real secret. Elena's breath caught in her throat. There was a thick, leather-bound book, its cover dark and worn with age. A diary. Next to it, tied with a piece of faded red string, was a bundle of thick, yellow documents, covered in elegant, old-fashioned script and official-looking stamps. They weren't money, they weren't gold, but as Elena looked at them, a cold premonition washed over her. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that these papers were infinitely more valuable and infinitely more dangerous than any treasure. She gently lifted the diary. The leather was cracked but supple, and the pages within were filled with dense, elegant handwriting. She opened it to a random page, the old paper releasing a dry, dusty scent. The ink was slightly faded, but the words were clear. It was a confession. The script was frantic, desperate, the words of a man tormented by his conscience. She didn't understand the full context, but she saw phrases that made her blood run cold. Forged documents, intimidation, stole their land, blood money. This wasn't just a savings box, it was a box of sins. The gold wasn't a gift, it was a curse. A heavy weight of dread began to replace the initial elation. She had not found a solution to her problems. She had just found a much larger and much more terrifying set of new ones. The secrets in this box felt alive, coiled like snakes, waiting to strike. She then picked up the bundle of documents tied with string. Her fingers, accustomed to the delicate work of a seamstress, fumbled with the brittle knot. It crumbled to dust under her touch. The documents unfolded in her hands. They were land deeds, original deeds. She could tell by the feel of the heavy paper and the embossed seals. The names on them were not familiar, but the locations described were in the surrounding region. They were detailed and official, and as she compared a name on one of the deeds to a name mentioned in a passage of the diary, the horrifying truth began to dawn on her. The diary was a confession of a crime, and these documents, these were the proof, they were the original, legitimate titles to land that had been stolen. The gold was the payment for the crime. The diary was the testimony of the criminal. She was holding a complete record of a massive, historical injustice. Her son, Leo, who had been watching in silence, finally spoke. "Mama, are we rich now?" he asked. his small voice full of awe as he pointed at the gleaming gold coins. Elena looked from the gold to the documents in her hand, and then to her son's innocent face. How could she explain it to him? How could she explain that this discovery, this treasure, was not a blessing, but a burden of the most terrible kind? The man who wrote this diary, a man whose blood ran in her late husband's veins, was a criminal. He had helped a powerful, ruthless entity destroy the lives of innocent people, and he had hidden the evidence and the profits of his crime in this wall, where it had waited for decades. The gold coins no longer looked beautiful. They looked tainted, stained with the suffering of others. Her heart ached with a new kind of poverty, a moral poverty she had inherited along with this ruin. The diary was from her husband's great-uncle, Ignazio. His name was written on the inside cover. He was a lawyer, and as she read the first few pages, the story poured out, a torrent of guilt and regret. In the 1970s, he had been hired by a wealthy and powerful family, the Valerius clan, to orchestrate a massive land-grabbing scheme. His job was to use his legal expertise to create fraudulent documents, to find loopholes, and to intimidate a dozen small, independent farm owners into abandoning their properties. He described how they would cut off access to water, file frivolous legal challenges to bankrupt them, and use threats of violence, all under a veneer of legality. The diary was a meticulous, horrifying account of how he had systematically ruined lives, one family at a time. The lands on, he wrote, were then consolidated and sold for a massive profit to a foreign mining corporation that still operated in the region. A wave of nausea rose in Elena's throat. She felt as though she were reading a horror story, but the weight of the original deeds in her lap made it sickeningly real. Ignazio wrote of his torment, of how the Valerius patriarch had paid him in gold, calling it a reward for his loyalty. But Ignazio couldn't bring himself to spend it. He saw it as blood money, a physical manifestation of his sin. He couldn't destroy the original deeds, a final, cowardly shred of his conscience, preventing him from erasing the truth completely. So he had built this secret compartment, this tomb for his guilt, and locked it all away, hoping it would never be found, or perhaps, in his darkest moments, praying that it would. He had died, according to the last entry, consumed by his own guilt, a prisoner of the secret he had locked in the wall. Elena closed the diary, her hands trembling. The weight of the secret was now hers. The gold coins, once a symbol of hope, now felt like embers, burning a hole in her conscience. There were dozens of them, enough to buy a house, to put Leo in a good school, to start a new life, to never be hungry or cold again. All she had to do was take them and leave. Forget the diary, burn the deeds, walk away from this dark history, and build a future for her son. The temptation was immense, a seductive whisper in the cold basement. Who would ever know? The victims were long gone, their stories forgotten, erased by time and the forgeries of a guilty lawyer. It was her word against a powerful family, a ghost's confession against a corporate empire. Taking the gold was the smart thing to do, the safe thing to do. It was the choice of a survivor, the choice of a mother desperate to protect her child from the world's cruelty. But as she looked at the yellowed deeds, she saw not just names, but families. Families like hers, who had their homes, their livelihoods, and their futures stolen from them. They had been made to feel the same desperation that she now felt, the same hunger, the same cold, the same hopelessness. The Valerius family. The name from the diary had built their fortune on the ruins of these people's lives, and Ignazio, her husband's own relative, had been the architect of that ruin. A deep, resonant anger began to burn through her fear and her temptation. It was an anger on behalf of a generation of ghosts, people whose stories were screaming to be told from the pages of the diary in her lap. Keeping the gold would not be a victory. It would be a continuation of the crime. It would make her a part of the same silent conspiracy that had destroyed so many. She suddenly understood. The blankets. It wasn't Ignazio's ghost. It was someone else. Someone who knew about this box. Someone who had been waiting. Someone who had seen her and Leo, destitute and desperate, and decided that the time had come for this secret to be revealed. They had given her the warmth to survive the night, a small act of mercy, so that she would have the strength to find this place and unearth the truth. It was a test, a choice. Would she take the blood money and run? Or would she take up the cause of the dead? The realization settled over her with a terrifying clarity. She was not a random inheritor of a worthless ruin. She had been chosen. She was standing at a crossroads, not just for her own life, but for a history of injustice that had been buried in the dark for half a century. The weight on her shoulders was immense, but for the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel entirely alone. She felt a purpose. The silence of the basement became a cathedral for the dead. Elena sat on the cold dirt floor, the heavy leather diary open in her lap, the bag of gold coins pushed into a dark corner, as if its glow might burn her. Her fingers, calloused now from prying open the wall, gently traced the elegant, frantic script. The scent of old paper and faded ink filled her nostrils, a dry, dusty smell of buried history. She felt her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat for a story that was demanding to be heard. The words of Ignacio de Almeida were not just ink on a page. They were a ghost's confession, a torrent of regret that flowed across the decades to find her in this cold, dark place. He wrote not of monsters, but of men in expensive suits, of handshakes that sealed fates and legal documents that were as deadly as any knife. She felt a profound and terrible connection to him, this phantom relative whose guilt had seeped into the very walls of her refuge, and she knew she could not turn away. She had to read. She had to bear witness. Ignacio's words painted a vivid, sickening picture of the 1970s. She read a passage aloud, her own voice a choked whisper in the stillness. He called it clearing the board. The Valerius Patriarch, a man with a smile like a shark and eyes that saw only obstacles, not people. He would point to a map, a tapestry of small family farms, and say, "I want this." And my job was to make it so. Elena felt a wave of nausea. The diary detailed the methods with chilling precision. It wasn't brute force at first, but a slow, legal strangulation. They would file challenges to land boundaries that had been respected for generations, burying the poor farmers in legal fees they could never hope to pay. They financed politicians to rezone a stream as industrial runoff, poisoning the water supply for half a dozen properties downstream. Each family was isolated, made to feel like their problem was unique, their failure their own. Elena's hands clenched into fists. She could feel the phantom despair of those families, the confusion turning to panic as their world was dismantled piece by legal piece. She turned the brittle page, her finger smudging a tear that had fallen on the ink. Here, Ignacio confessed his most direct crimes. When the law wasn't enough, we used fear. A barn would mysteriously burn in the night. A prize bull would be found sick, poisoned. Rumors were spread in the nearest town about a farmer's debts or his wife's infidelity. Elena had to stop, her breath catching in a sob. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, designed to break a person's spirit until they were so beaten down, so exhausted, that when Ignacio arrived with a lowball cash offer, it felt like a lifeline, not the final act of theft. He was the friendly face of their destruction. The gold coins in the corner of the basement seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, each one a family's tears, a lifetime of work turned to dust. The weight of this knowledge was physical, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She was no longer just a destitute widow. She was the sole heir to a legacy of profound evil, the custodian of a crime that had been perfectly executed and completely forgotten. The name Valerius was branded into her mind. The Valerius clan. The diary mentioned a son, a young man at the time, who watched his father's machinations with a cold, unsettling admiration. He was learning the family business. A chill that had nothing to do with the basement's dampness crept up Elena's spine. The construction company, the company where her husband had died. The compensation papers, the ones with the insulting pittance of a payment, flashed in her memory. She scrambled through the bag where she kept her few important papers, her hands shaking violently. She pulled out the letter from the company. Her eyes scanned the elegant letterhead, and then she saw it at the bottom, above a crisp, authoritative signature. The company's owner and CEO, Doubter Antenor Valerius, the son, the boy who had watched and learned how to be a shark. The blood drained from her face. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Her husband hadn't just inherited a worthless piece of land. He had inherited a claim against the very man he worked for. The world tilted on its axis. Her husband's death. The suspicious accident was suddenly cast in a sinister, terrifying new light. He was a meticulous man. He was careful, but he had also been curious. In the weeks before his death, he had been excited about the inheritance, trying to find the old property on maps, asking questions in the county records office. Had he found something? Had he stumbled upon the edge of this same dark secret? Had he asked the wrong question to the wrong person? The thought was a shard of ice in her heart. She felt the bile rise in her throat. She wasn't just the victim of a random tragedy. She and Leo were the debris of a crime that was still being committed, a conspiracy that was still active, still protecting itself. The danger wasn't buried in the past with Ignazio. It was alive, it was powerful, and it was the reason her husband was dead. She clutched the diary to her chest, the leather cover a fragile shield. This box wasn't a treasure chest, it was a motive for murder, and now she was holding it. Her frantic thoughts were shattered by a sound so alien to this place that it felt like a gunshot. It was the low, powerful purr of an expensive car engine, growing closer. Elena froze, her every muscle tensed. No one came out here. The road was barely a road. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She shoved the diary and the deeds back into the hollow in the wall, her hands clumsy with panic. She threw a dirty blanket over the metal strongbox, hiding the gold. Peering through a grimy crack in the high basement window, she saw it. A gleaming black Mercedes, spotless despite the muddy track, had stopped in the clearing in front of the ruin. The engine cut, and the sudden silence was deafening, heavy with menace. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, around 60, dressed in a perfectly tailored grey suit that seemed to repel the surrounding decay. Even from a distance, he radiated an aura of immense power and cold control. He stood for a moment, his polished black shoes a stark contrast to the mud and weeds, and surveyed the collapsed house with a look of detached distaste. He was exactly as she had imagined him from the diary's description of the boy. Elegant, composed, and utterly ruthless. Elena felt her blood run cold. She didn't need to be told who he was. It was him. Doubter Valerius. He had come here, to this place. The timing could not be a coincidence. He knew. Somehow, he knew she was here. Her mind raced. Did he know about the diary? Did he suspect she had found it? Or was this just another move in the long, patient game his family had been playing for 50 years? A final piece to clear from the board. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She was trapped. She backed away from the window, pressing herself against the cold, damp concrete of the far wall, trying to make herself invisible. She grabbed Leo, who was watching with wide, frightened eyes, and pulled him behind her, shielding him with her body. The game was no longer historical. It was here and now. She heard his footsteps approaching the house, the confident, measured tread of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't enter the collapsed structure, but circled it slowly, his gaze analytical, as if assessing its final demolition. Elena held her breath, praying he would just leave, that he wouldn't think to look in the one part of the house that was still standing. The footsteps stopped. Silence. It stretched for an eternity, thick with her own frantic heartbeat. Then she heard his voice, smooth and cultured, but carrying an unmistakable edge of command that cut through the air. "Hello, is anyone there? My name is Doubter Valerius. I was a friend of the late owner." The lie was so bald-faced, so audacious, it almost made her gasp. Friend? He was no friend. He was a vulture circling a carcass. She remained silent, pressed into the shadows, Leo trembling behind her. She prayed he would assume the place was empty and leave, but she knew men like him didn't leave until they got what they came for. The heavy wooden door at the top of the basement stairs groaned open. A silhouette blocked the weak light from above. "Senora, Elena," he called down, his voice now laced with a tone of false concern. "I heard about your tragedy. With your husband. I am the owner of the company where he worked. I came to see if you were all right. I heard you might have moved here." He was playing the part of the benevolent patron, the concerned employer. Elena felt a cold rage mix with her terror. The hypocrisy was suffocating. He had killed her husband, and now he was pretending to offer condolences. She had no choice. Hiding was pointless. Taking a shaky breath, she stepped out of the shadows, keeping Leo behind her. "Yes," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here." He descended the stone steps slowly, his expensive shoes making soft, deliberate sounds. As he entered the dim light of the basement, his face became clear. He had kind eyes, a well-practiced lie, but his smile didn't reach them. They were cold, flat, and sharp as glass. "My dear woman," he began, his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy as he took in the squalor of the basement, the makeshift bed, the dirt floor. "You cannot live like this. It is unconscionable. Your husband was a good employee. It is a tragedy what happened." He let the word hang in the air. Tragedy. Not accident, not murder. Tragedy. Elena felt her jaw clench. She had to stay calm. She had to pretend she knew nothing. "We are managing," she said, her voice tight. Valerius gave a sad shake of his head. "This is no place for a grieving widow and her son. The land is worthless, the house a death trap. In fact, I came here to make you an offer. As a gesture of goodwill for your husband's service, I will buy this property from you, 10,000 rees, cash, enough for you to get a small apartment back in the city, to get back on your feet." He said the number as if it were a grand fortune, a king's ransom, but Elena knew. It was an insult. It was the final move to secure the land, to erase the last loose thread of Ignacio's crime. 10,000 reais. It was more money than she had, but it was nothing. It was a pittance for a secret that was worth millions, for a crime that had cost her husband his life. The gold coins hidden under the blanket were worth 20 times that. The land itself, with its original deeds, was worth 100 times more. He was treating her like the farmers from the diary, assuming her desperation would make her stupid, make her grateful for the scraps from his table. Elena looked into his cold, waiting eyes and felt a flicker of defiance. "I'm not interested in selling," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She saw a brief flash of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked by his pleasant facade. He had expected her to fall at his feet with gratitude. He hadn't expected resistance. Her refusal changed the temperature in the room. The air grew colder, heavier. The mask of the benevolent doubter was beginning to slip. He was not used to being told no. He took a step closer, his cologne a rich, spicy scent, invading her space and making her feel sick. His voice dropped, losing its sympathetic tone and taking on a low, chilling quality. "You should reconsider, Senora. This is a very generous offer for a pile of rubble." He gestured around the damp basement. "And this place, it holds bad memories, I'm sure. It would be best to leave it all behind." He paused, letting the silence stretch. Elena could feel the threat coiling beneath his words. He knew she was vulnerable, and he was beginning to squeeze. She clutched Leo's shoulder tighter, her knuckles white. She could feel her son's small body tense, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The pretense was over. This was not a negotiation. This was an ultimatum. The friendly mask had fallen away completely, revealing the predator beneath. He was the shark from Ignacio's diary, and she was the last obstacle between him and his prize. His eyes, no longer pretending warmth, narrowed slightly. He looked past her, his gaze lingering on the collapsed structure above them. "Your husband," he said, his voice now a soft, menacing purr that was more terrifying than any shout. He was a good man, but perhaps a little too curious for his own good. He started asking questions about this land before the accident. He let the word hang in the air. A poisoned dart. It's a terrible shame he was so careless. Valerius's gaze met hers, and in that moment, she saw the absolute certainty of his guilt. There was no remorse, only a cold, hard finality. "Old, abandoned places like this can be very dangerous," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Unstable. Things fall. Accidents happen. It would be a terrible tragedy for a boy to lose both his parents to carelessness. Think about my offer. Senora, for your son's sake." The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare. A cold, sharp blade pressed against her throat. He turned without waiting for a response and ascended the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the sudden, ringing silence. The sound of the Mercedes's engine starting up was a roar, and then it faded, leaving Elena alone in the dark, her body trembling uncontrollably. He knew he had killed her husband, and he would not hesitate to kill her and Leo to protect his secret. The diary in its hiding place felt like a block of ice, the gold a cursed weight. She was standing at an impossible crossroads. One path was survival. Take the blood money he offered, or even just the gold from the box and run. Disappear, bury the truth and save her son from the monster who now knew exactly where they were. The other path was justice, using the diary and the deeds to expose Valerius, to fight for the ghosts of his victims and for the memory of her husband. But that path led directly into the path of a murderer who had already proven he would eliminate any threat. She looked down at Leo, whose face was buried in her side, his small hands clutching her shirt. His safety was the only thing in the world that mattered. The choice was agonizing, a razor's edge between moral duty and a mother's instinct to protect her child at all costs. The path of justice was guarded by a killer, and the path of survival meant letting him win, becoming a silent accomplice to his crimes. She felt the weight of generations of secrets on her shoulders, the lives of the dispossessed and the life of her own son hanging in the balance. What would you do in her place? Would you take the gold, bury the truth, and run for your life to protect your child? Or would you risk everything, confronting a man who has already killed once, for a justice that might cost you everything you have left? The choice she makes will change everything. The silence Valerius left behind was a living entity, more menacing than his whispered threats. It filled the cold basement, pressing in on Elena, making the air thick and hard to breathe. Her heart, which had been hammering with terror, now beat with a frantic, skittish rhythm, like a rabbit sensing the shadow of a hawk. Every sound was magnified. The drip of water from the ceiling was a footstep. The rustle of a rat in the debris was the scrape of a key in a lock. He had been here. The scent of his expensive cologne lingered faintly, a ghostly reminder of the predator who had invaded her den. She felt exposed, pinned under the microscope of a man who erased problems as easily as swatting a fly. She looked at the hidden compartment, now feeling like a gaping wound in the wall. The diary and the deeds within were no longer just a secret. They were her death warrant, signed and dated. The choice he had given her was no choice at all. It was an executioner offering a blindfold. A war raged inside her, a hurricane of instinct and conscience. The mother in her screamed to run, to take Leo and disappear into the vastness of Brazil, to change their names and live in the shadows. The gold coins hidden under the blanket could buy them that escape. It was a coward's choice, but it was a survivor's choice. It was the choice that would let her watch Leo grow up. But then the faces of the ghosts from the diary would rise in her mind, the farmers whose lives were systematically dismantled, their legacies erased, and her husband's face not as he was in life, laughing and strong, but as she imagined him in his final moments, confused and betrayed. To run would be to spit on their memory, to become a silent partner in the crime that had orphaned her son. A cold, hard anger, born of utter desperation, began to crystallize in her chest. She would not be another ghost in the Valerius family's closet. She would not let him win. But what could she do? She was a mouse against a lion. Her mind seized on the one impossible detail that preceded the horror. The blankets. They were an anomaly, an act of pure kindness in this narrative of greed and death. Valerius would never have left blankets. The person who left them was not a threat. They were a guardian. The thought was a single point of light in an oppressive darkness. This person knew she was here. They knew she and Leo were cold. They were watching. Who were they? And why had they helped her? A desperate, reckless plan began to form in her mind. She had to find them. She had to trust this one act of anonymous grace. It was a wild gamble, leaving the relative safety of her concrete prison to search for a phantom. But staying here was a death sentence anyway. Valerius would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but his threat hung in the air like poison. She had to move. She had to find the one person in this desolate place who might be an ally. She had to believe that the trail of breadcrumbs hadn't led her here just to die. With a resolve she didn't know she possessed, Eleanor made a decision. She tucked a small, sharp piece of scrap metal into her pocket, a pathetic weapon that gave her a sliver of courage. "Leo," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "We're going for a walk, a little exploration." She tried to make it sound like an adventure, but Leo's wide, solemn eyes told her he knew better. He simply nodded and took her hand. Leaving the strongbox and the diary hidden, they ascended the stone steps into the ruined house. Stepping out into the daylight felt surreal. The world seemed too bright, too loud, after the tomb-like silence of the basement. The air was fresh and smelled of pine and wet earth. For the first time, Eleanor looked at the surrounding landscape not as a prison, but as a place to be searched. The property was surrounded by a dense, tangled forest, a wall of green in every direction. There were no roads, no other houses in sight. The isolation was absolute. Where could anyone even be hiding? Then she saw it. Far to the west, barely visible above the canopy of trees, was a thin, almost transparent wisp of grey smoke curling lazily into the sky. It was a sign of life. A chimney, a fire, a person. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was miles away, a daunting trek through the unfamiliar woods, but it was a destination. It was a chance. There, she whispered, more to herself than to Leo. As we're going there, the journey was an ordeal. They had to fight through thick undergrowth, their clothes snagging on thorny bushes, their feet sinking into soft, marshy ground. The sounds of the forest, once menacing, were now just background noise to the frantic pounding of her own heart. With every step, she alternated between hope and terror. Was she walking toward salvation, or into an even more elaborate trap? Leo, bless his heart, trudged along without complaint, his small hand a constant, warm anchor in hers. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and they emerged into a small, overgrown clearing. In the center stood a tiny, dilapidated cabin, built of dark, weathered wood, looking almost as ancient as the forest itself. The smoke was coming from its stone chimney. The cabin looked deserted, almost derelict, but the smoke was undeniable. A small, untended garden grew wild near the front, with a few hardy vegetables pushing through the weeds. It was a place of deep solitude, the home of someone who wanted to be left alone by the world. Elena's courage faltered. What if she was wrong? What if the occupant was hostile? She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, hidden by the trees, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. But then the cabin door creaked open, and a man emerged. He was old, ancient even, with skin like wrinkled parchment and a shock of white hair. He moved slowly, his back bent with age, leaning heavily on a gnarled walking stick. He wore simple, patched clothes and carried a small basket, which he began to fill with vegetables from his garden. He hadn't seen them. This was her chance. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stepped out from the cover of the trees, pulling Leo with her. "Senor," she called out, her voice cracking. The old man froze, then turned slowly, his eyes squinting against the light. He looked at her, then at Leo, and his face showed no surprise. There was no alarm, no fear, only a deep, weary sadness and a flicker of recognition. It was as if he had been expecting them. "I knew you would come eventually," he said, his voice a dry rustle, like autumn leaves. "I am Anselmo." Elena's legs felt weak with relief. This was him. This had to be him. Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back began to stream down her face. All the fear, the tension, the suffocating weight of the past few days came pouring out of her in a torrent of choked words. She told him everything, about the basement, the cold, the desperation, about the blankets that had appeared like a miracle, about the hollow wall, the strongbox, the gold, the diary. She spoke of Valerius's visit, of the veiled threats, of the name on her husband's company letterhead. She was a dam bursting, the pressure of the secret too much to bear alone. She felt like she was confessing, begging for absolution or guidance from this strange, ancient man in the middle of the woods. Anselmo listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face. He nodded slowly, as if she were merely confirming a story he already knew by heart. When she finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, he gestured with his gnarled hand towards the cabin. "Come inside," he said gently. "It is not much, but it is warm. You must be terrified." The inside of the cabin was a single, cluttered room, smelling of wood smoke, dried herbs, and old books. It was the smell of a long life, lived simply. He sat them down at a small, rough-hewn table and placed a cup of hot, sweet tea made from herbs into Elena's shaking hands. The warmth seeped into her fingers, a small comfort in a world of cold terror. "The blankets," Muki said finally. "Yes, it was me. I have been watching over that house since my friend Ignazio died in it. It was my promise to him." Elena stared at him, her mind reeling. Ignazio. He had known Ignazio. He was the key. He was the missing piece of the entire horrifying puzzle. The mystery of the blankets was solved, but 100 new questions bloomed in its place. "You were his friend," Elena whispered. Her voice filled with awe and disbelief. Anselmo's eyes, pale blue and clouded with age, seemed to look into the past. "More than a friend," he said softly. "We grew up together in this very region, before the mining company, before the Valerius plague. Ignacio was a good man, a brilliant man, but he was weak, ambitious. The Valerius patriarch saw that ambition and twisted it, molded it into a weapon." He sighed, a deep, rattling sound from the bottom of his soul. He used Ignacio to lend a veneer of legality to his theft, and it destroyed him. In the end, the guilt was a cancer that ate him from the inside out. He looked directly at Elena, his gaze sharp and clear. "He didn't just write that diary, Senora. He confessed it all to me, right here in this room, a week before his heart gave out. He told me everything, every crime, every family he helped destroy." A heavy silence filled the small cabin, thick with the weight of a 50-year-old sin. "But I had no proof," Anselmo continued, his voice laced with the bitterness of decades of impotence. "It was my word, the word of a poor old recluse, against the Valerius Empire. Who would have believed me? After he died, I searched the house, but I couldn't find where he had hidden the evidence. I knew it had to be there. Ignacio wasn't brave enough to confess to the world, but he was too terrified of God to destroy the truth entirely. So I waited. I have tended his grave and watched over that ruin for 40 years, waiting for someone to come, waiting for a sign." He looked from Elena to Leo, and his eyes softened. "When I saw you and the boy arrive so desperate, I knew it was time. Ignacio's blood had returned to his place of sin. I left the blanket so you would survive the cold, so you would have the strength to find what I never could." He gestured towards her bag, where she had instinctively put the diary. "That book, that is his courage, sent 40 years too late." Anselmo leaned forward, his expression growing darker, more intense. "But there are things that are not in that diary, things Ignacio only confessed to me when the fear of hell was upon him. Antenor Valerius, the man who visited you, is not just a thief. He is a monster far worse than his father ever was." Elena felt a cold dread snake its way up her spine. The old man, the patriarch, in his final years, he grew sentimental. He was sick, and he started talking about making amends, about giving some of the money back. He was becoming a liability to the empire he had built. Anselmo's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a secret he had carried alone for decades. Antenor couldn't have that. He smothered his own father with a pillow in his sleep. He called it a peaceful passing from his illness. He inherited everything, and the secret was safe. Antenor didn't just steal land. He murdered his own father to protect the fortune built on that theft. The revelation was so monstrous it was hard to comprehend. Elena felt the room spin. The man in the tailored suit, the doubter with the sympathetic smile, was not just a corporate criminal. He was a patricide, a man who would kill his own flesh and blood to protect his power. The pieces of the puzzle were clicking into place, each one more horrifying than the last. She finally found her voice, asking the question that had been burning in her heart, a question she was terrified to have answered. "And my husband?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "His accident?" Anselmo's kind eyes filled with a profound pity, and he reached across the table, placing his gnarled and warm hand over hers. "There are no accidents with Antenor Valerius," he said, his voice heavy with grim certainty. "Only solutions. Your husband started looking into the land records. He was a meticulous man, you said. He must have found an inconsistency, a name that didn't match, a date that was wrong. He must have asked a question, perhaps even of someone at the company. A question is all it would take," Anselmo continued, his grip on her hand tightening. "For 40 years, that land has been a dormant volcano. Your husband inheriting it was a risk Valerius could not afford. A curious heir was a threat. When your husband started digging, he signed his own death warrant. The accident at the construction site was an execution, plain and simple. It was a message, a warning, just like his visit to you today." Elena let out a choked sob, the final, brutal confirmation of her deepest fear shattering the last of her composure. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a fact. Her husband, her kind, laughing husband, had been murdered. He had been eliminated by the smiling shark because he had gotten too close to a 50-year-old crime. She was not a widow. She was the wife of a man who had been murdered for the truth, and she was now the guardian of that truth. The diary and the deeds were not just a record of past crimes. They were the evidence of an active, ongoing conspiracy of murder. A fierce, burning rage unlike anything she had ever felt before surged through Eleanor, incinerating her fear. It was a righteous fire, fed by grief and injustice. The tears stopped. Her hand under Anselmo's clenched into a tight fist. Her fate, her husband's fate, and the fate of all those families from the diary were now intertwined. This was her fight now. She looked from Anselmo to Leo, who had been listening with a child's silent, intuitive understanding. She would not run. She would not hide. She would not let her son grow up knowing his mother was a coward who let his father's killer walk free. She would see this through to the end, whatever the cost. "He will not win," she said, her voice low and hard, infused with a strength that surprised even herself. "This ends now. We will use this proof. We will take it to someone. The police, a newspaper, someone will listen." Anselmo nodded, a flicker of fierce pride in his old eyes. For the first time in 40 years, he was not alone in his vigil. He had found his army. Just as this new, dangerous resolve settled over them, a familiar sound cut through the quiet of the forest. It was the low, predatory purr of an expensive engine. Anselmo's head snapped up, his face instantly pale with alarm. Elena's heart plummeted into her stomach. They rushed to the cabin's single grimy window. On the dirt track below the clearing, the road that led back towards the ruin, the black Mercedes was cruising slowly by, like a shark gliding through the water. The back window was down, and she could see him clearly. Doubter Valerius was in the back seat, his face a cold, emotionless mask. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking directly at Anselmo's cabin. He saw the wisp of smoke from the chimney, and as the car passed, his eyes met Elena's through the window for a split second. She saw no flicker of recognition, no anger. She saw only a cold, chilling finality, a decision being made. He had seen them. He had seen the widow of the man he'd killed conferring with the one man left alive who knew his original sins. "He knows," Anselmo breathed, his voice a terrified whisper. He stumbled back from the window, his face ashen. The strength he had shown moments before evaporated, replaced by the deep instinctual fear of a man who knew exactly what Valerius was capable of. "He saw us together. He knows I know. He knows I would tell you everything." The implications were immediate and terrifying. They were no longer just a potential threat. They were active conspirators. They were loose ends, and Antenor Valerius did not leave loose ends. The game of threats and intimidation was over. The time for subtlety had passed. Now only the final, brutal solution remained. Anselmo grabbed Elena's shoulders, his hands trembling, his eyes wide with urgency. "He won't wait," he rasped. "He will act tonight. He will not risk another sunrise. He will send men. He will burn everything. The house, this cabin, and anyone in them. He needs to erase it all. The proof, the witnesses, everything." The terror was immediate and absolute, a physical blow that knocked the air from her lungs. This wasn't a future threat. It was a promise of violence that would be fulfilled in a matter of hours. Her mind raced, a chaotic storm of panic. The basement, the strongbox, Leo. "What do we do?" she cried, her voice breaking. Anselmo's fear sharpened into frantic purpose. "Listen to me," he commanded, his grip tightening. "There is no time. Go back. Now. Before his men get there. Grab your son and the box. The box is everything. Do not take anything else. Forget the blankets. Forget your bag. Just the boy and the box." He pushed her towards the door, his urgency a physical force. "On the north side of the ruin there is a small stream. Follow it west, deep into the woods. Don't stop for anything. I will find you. Just run." He was shoving her out of the cabin, his face a mask of desperate resolve. "Go, now. For your husband. For your boy. Live to fight, Eleanor. Live." Adrenaline surged through her, a cold, chemical fire. She grabbed Leo's hand and plunged back into the forest, no longer fighting the undergrowth, but crashing through it, heedless of the branches that scratched her face and arms. The journey that had taken hours now felt like it had to be covered in minutes. Every snap of a twig behind them sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. She could feel Valerius's cold eyes on her back, could feel the approach of his faceless henchman. She ran with a desperation born of pure terror, dragging Leo behind her. The boy, sensing the life-or-death urgency, scrambled to keep up, his small face pale and determined, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. When the ruin finally appeared through the trees, it no longer looked like a grave, but like a ticking bomb. She had to get in, get the proof, and get out before it exploded. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearing, and the world was bathed in a blood-red light. They scrambled down the stone steps into the basement. The air was cold and still, the eye of the hurricane. Elena's movements were frantic but precise. "Leo, we have to play a hiding game, a very important one. We cannot make a sound," she whispered, her voice tight and strained. She ripped the dirty blanket off the metal strongbox. She shoved the diary, the deeds, and the bag of gold coins inside. The metallic clink of the coins, a sickeningly loud sound in the silence. The box was heavy, a dead weight. It was the weight of her husband's life, of Ignazio's guilt, of dozens of stolen farms. It was the weight of justice, and she almost buckled under it. She heaved it into her arms, her muscles screaming in protest. Just as she straightened up, a new sound reached them from outside, freezing the blood in her veins. It was the crunch of tires on gravel, a sound much heavier and rougher than a Mercedes. A truck. Then a car door slammed shut. Low voices. They were here. There was no time to think, only to react. Anselmo's words echoed in her mind. North side. The stream. Run. The main entrance was blocked. Her eyes darted around the ruined house in her mind's eye. There was a large hole in the back wall of the house, where part of the foundation had crumbled away. It was their only chance. Cradling the impossibly heavy box in one arm and grabbing Leo's hand with the other, she half ran, half stumbled up the stone steps. She peeked out. Two men, dark silhouettes against the twilight, were walking towards the front of the house. They moved with a predatory confidence. She ducked back, her heart hammering so hard she thought they would hear it. She pulled Leo towards the back of the ruin, moving through the debris as silently as a ghost. They squeezed through the hole in the foundation and out into the cool night air. They were out. For a moment, she thought they had made it. They plunged into the tree line at the edge of the clearing, the darkness of the woods swallowing them whole. They didn't dare to go far. Just deep enough into the woods to be hidden by the darkness and the thick trees, Elena collapsed behind a massive oak tree, her lungs burning, her arms shaking from the weight of the box. She pulled Leo close, his small body trembling violently. She put a hand over his mouth, not to silence a cry, but to comfort him, to let him know she was there. From their hiding place, they had a clear view of the ruin. The two men were now circling the structure. One was carrying two large canisters. The sharp chemical smell of gasoline drifted towards them on the night breeze, a scent that promised annihilation. Elena felt a wave of cold, absolute horror wash over her. Anselmo was right. This was not a threat, this was erasure. They were going to burn it all, hoping she and her son were sleeping inside, hoping to turn them into ash and memory. One of the men unscrewed a canister and began splashing the contents all around the base of the house, soaking the rotted wood and the crumbling stone walls. The liquid glistened in the moonlight, a harbinger of the inferno to come. The other man stood back, holding something in his hand, a lighter. He flicked it once. A small, brave flame appeared in the darkness, a tiny star of destruction. He tossed it. The whoosh of the ignition was a sudden, violent roar, a beast inhaling. The night exploded into a terrifying orange brilliance. The flames didn't just catch, they detonated, racing around the base of the house and climbing the walls with an unnatural speed. The ruin, their only shelter, their place of secrets, was instantly transformed into a raging pyre. The heat washed over them even in the woods, a blast of scorching air that smelled of burning history and gasoline. The fire roared with a hungry, malevolent sound, consuming everything. Elena watched in mute, paralyzed horror, her arms wrapped around her son, shielding his eyes from the monstrous spectacle. The fire climbed higher, a column of flame and black smoke reaching for the stars. The remaining timbers of the roof groaned and then collapsed inward with a great shower of sparks, feeding the inferno. It was a funeral pyre for a house, for a secret, for a life. They were meant to be in there. Valerius hadn't just wanted to destroy the evidence. He had ordered their execution. The thought was so cold, so absolute. It cut through her terror and left behind a core of pure, unadulterated ice. She was holding a box of proof against a man who would burn children alive to protect himself. The flames cast dancing, demonic shadows through the woods, illuminating her pale, tear-streaked face and Leo's wide, terrified eyes. They were alone, hunted, their only refuge a column of smoke against the night sky. They were trapped, mesmerized by the destructive beauty of the fire, when a hand suddenly clamped down on Elena's shoulder. She let out a strangled gasp and spun around, ready to fight, the heavy box a clumsy weapon. But it was Anselmo. His ancient face was illuminated by the flickering firelight, his eyes wide and urgent. He put a single, gnarled finger to his lips, demanding silence. He had circled around, using his knowledge of the woods to approach them without being seen. He saw the box clutched in her arms and gave a single, sharp nod of approval. He didn't waste a moment. He leaned in close, his voice a barely audible whisper against the roar of the fire. "He will think you are in there," he breathed, his breath smelling of fear and exertion. "His men will wait until it is nothing but ash. This is our only chance. We must go now. Before they realize you are gone." He turned and beckoned them to follow him, deeper into the pitch-black woods, away from the fire and into a darkness that felt both terrifying and safe. Anselmo led them through the oppressive darkness, a ghost moving with a certainty born from a lifetime in these woods. The roar of the fire faded behind them, replaced by the frantic pounding of Elena's heart and the rasp of her own breathing. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, her arms numb from the crushing weight of the metal box. It was a physical burden of sin and justice she refused to put down. The sharp, clean scent of pine mingled with the acrid smoke clinging to her clothes and hair, a perfume of death and escape. She clutched Leo's hand, his small fingers cold in hers, and focused on the stooped, determined silhouette of the old man ahead. He was their North Star in a world that had gone completely black. There was no time for tears, no space for the terror that threatened to swallow her whole. The fire had burned away her despair, leaving behind a core of cold, hard resolve. She was no longer a victim fleeing. She was a courier, and the package she carried was a bomb aimed at the heart of an empire. Anselmo finally stopped in a hidden hollow, far from the glow of the distant pyre. He sank onto a fallen log, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that worried Elena. From inside his patched coat, he pulled a small cash-worn leather pouch, the drawstring frayed with age. He poured the contents into his trembling, gnarled hand, a small, pathetic collection of worn and folded bills, his entire life's savings. "It is not much," he rasped, the words catching in his throat, "but it will be enough. For 2 bus tickets to the capital. You must go. You cannot stay here." He pressed the money into Elena's hand, his skin as dry and fragile as old paper. "Hey, there is a woman there, a lawyer. Her name is Dr. Alvis. She is a warrior who hates men like Valerius with a holy passion. I knew her father. Find her. Give her the box. It is the only way." Elena felt a wave of overwhelming gratitude and a terrible as crushing sense of debt. This old man was giving her everything he had, betting his life's meager savings on her, and a ghost's confession. The bus rumbled through the night, a metal cocoon hurtling them towards an unknown fate. This journey was a ghostly echo of the one that had brought her to the ruin, but everything had changed. Before, she was adrift in despair. Now she was propelled by a dangerous purpose. The heavy metal box sat on her lap, a cold, solid anchor in a world that had dissolved into chaos. Its weight was a constant, tangible reminder of her husband's life, of Anselmo's sacrifice, and of the justice she now carried. Leo slept fitfully against her side, his face pale in the flickering lights of passing cars, a child forced to witness horrors no one should ever see. As the first hints of dawn broke, the distant glow of the state capital appeared on the horizon. The sprawling city lights, once a symbol of the life she had lost, now looked like the front line of a war she was about to begin. She felt a tremor of fear, but beneath it, the cold resolve held firm. She was no longer Elena the victim. She was Elena the avenger. The law office of Dr. Sofia Alves was in a tall, stern building of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the sky. Elena, covered in soot and grime from the forest, her hair matted and her clothes torn, felt the judgmental stares of people in crisp suits as she walked through the polished lobby. She clutched the rusted strongbox to her chest, a relic from another world. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt like an imposter, a beggar about to be thrown back onto the street. The lawyer's secretary, a young woman with perfectly manicured nails, looked at her with undisguised disdain. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, and her voice cold. Elena's own voice was a dry whisper. "No, but please, tell her it is about Antenor Valerius. Tell her Anselmo sent me." The name was a key. A flicker of interest crossed the secretary's face. She spoke quietly into an intercom. A moment later, a firm, clear voice replied, "Send her in, now." The door to the inner office buzzed open. Dr. Sofia Alves was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a severe haircut that meant business. Her office smelled of expensive leather and old books, a fortress of intellect and power. She gestured for Elena to sit, her gaze taking in the dirt, the fear, and the heavy metal box. "Anselmo," she stated, her voice devoid of pleasantries. "I haven't heard that name in 30 years. He said you have a story about Valerius." Elena began to speak, her voice trembling at first, a fragile thread of sound. But as she recounted the events, the eviction, the cold basement, the discovery, the fire, her voice grew stronger, fueled by the furnace of her rage and grief. She finished, her breath catching in her throat, and placed the strongbox on the massive mahogany desk. With shaking hands, she lifted the heavy lid. The soft glow of the gold coins, the yellowed stack of deeds, and the dark leather of the diary lay exposed under the cool fluorescent lights of the modern world. Dr. Alves leaned forward, her professional demeanor replaced by an almost feral intensity. She completely ignored the gold. Her slender, expert fingers reached for the bundle of deeds, her touch surprisingly gentle on the brittle paper. She scanned the first one, her eyes flying across the old script, her lips a thin, hard line. "Original titles. Legally perfect," she murmured, more to herself than to Elena. Then she picked up the diary. She opened it, the scent of a 50-year-old crime filling the sterile air. She read a passage, her expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "My God," she whispered, looking up at Elena, her eyes blazing. "This isn't just a confession. It's a blueprint. It's a meticulous record of how he built his empire on the bones of innocent people." She closed the book with a soft, final thud. "This Valerius, he has no idea what is about to hit him. You did the right thing, Senora. You brought this to the right place. He won't get away with it. Not this time." Dr. Alves moved with the swift, decisive energy of a predator. She didn't call the local police. She knew they were likely on Valerius's payroll. Instead, she placed a call directly to a special prosecutor within the federal police, a man known for his bulldog tenacity in pursuing high-level corruption. The meeting was arranged in a secure, undisclosed location that same afternoon. Eleanor, feeling numb and disconnected from her own body, found herself in a quiet, windowless room, telling her story again. This time, her voice was clear and steady. She was no longer a terrified woman, but a key witness. The federal agents listened in grim silence, their faces unreadable. Dr. Alves laid out the evidence on the table, the diary, the deeds, the gold, and Anselmo's recorded testimony, which the lawyer had arranged over the phone. It was an irrefutable, perfectly preserved case file from the grave. The prosecutor looked at the evidence, then at Eleanor. "Senora," he said, his voice grave, "your courage will bring justice for many, including your husband." The raid was swift and merciless. Dr. Antenor Valerius was in his penthouse office, a glass cage overlooking the city he believed he owned, finalizing a deal on the phone. He felt untouchable, serene in the knowledge that his final problem had been reduced to ash and smoke in the countryside. He didn't even hear them coming. The heavy oak doors to his office didn't open. They imploded. A team of black-clad federal police agents swarmed the room, weapons raised. The phone dropped from his hand, clattering on the marble floor. For a single, frozen moment, his mask of sophisticated control shattered, revealing a flash of pure, primal shock and disbelief. He didn't resist. The click of the handcuffs snapping around his wrists was a small, cold, metallic sound that echoed the end of an era. As they led him away, stripped of his power and his tailored suit jacket, his empire, Hans, built on decades of murder and deceit, had already begun to crumble into dust. The news of his arrest was the lead story on every channel before he even reached the federal precinct. The fall of the House of Valerius was as spectacular as its rise was corrupt. The diary opened a floodgate of historical crimes, and Elena's testimony gave a voice to the voiceless. Inspired by the news, other families whose ancestors had been cheated out of their land came forward, their old stories finally heard. The case was a national sensation. In the end, justice was absolute. The courts recognized the legitimacy of the original deeds hidden in the wall. As the sole heir of Ignacio de Almeida, the man whose confession had brought down an empire, Elena was legally awarded ownership of not only her small, ruined plot, but of all the lands whose titles were in the box. The mining corporation, facing a massive scandal, was forced into a settlement. An astronomical sum of money was transferred to an account in her name. Elena stared at the number on the bank statement, a figure so large it seemed unreal, and she could only think of the 4 wrinkled 10-real notes she had counted on a dusty floor a lifetime ago, 1 year later. The air in the small, sunlit kitchen smelled of roasting chicken and fresh bread. It was the scent of peace, of abundance. There were no damp concrete walls, no gnawing hunger, no cold seeping into their bones. Leo sat at a sturdy wooden table, his laughter bright and easy, as he did his homework from the good school he now attended. In the corner of the living room, a brand-new sewing machine gleamed, its silent potential a promise of creativity and passion reclaimed. Elena watched her son, her heart filled with a quiet, profound warmth that had nothing to do with the oven. She had her life back, not the one she had lost, but a new one, forged in fire and built on a foundation of justice. Her husband's memory was not a source of pain, but of honor. She had not let him die in vain. If her story of resilience and justice moved you, and you believe that truth can triumph over darkness, make sure you subscribe to our channel and ring the bell. You won't want to miss another story of hope found in the most unexpected of places.